Hey everybody, welcome to Farmer Jam. Jam is just what it means. It's to get up and say whatever you want without restrictions about how the fact that you're a fan of Phil, if you have a funny story about you and Phil, if you had a chance to meet him at a prior FarmerCon, or even if you didn't have a chance to meet him, but just how you were influenced, the impact that he had on your life. This is a very personal type of event, right? And so really anything goes except 10 minutes or 15 minutes per person does not go. That's what does not go, all right? We're looking probably at about 5 minutes per person. Don't have to fill the 5 minutes. I'm probably gonna talk for 30 seconds and then sit back down. But we'll kind of give a little, at the 4 minute mark when someone's still talking, we'll kind of give a little, give one more minute. So with that said, I think that Mike has, actually I have the list here. We don't have to go in order either. I think we have a couple of people who had asked to go first, so we'll let those gentlemen go first. Real quickly though, before we do that, I was asked by the Pulp Fest organizers to administer the door prize for this. So the door prize, we have some donations. We have some Airship 27 Gun Glory. He rode a gunfighter's trail by R.A. Jones. And then the other one, we have a Secret Agent X, who is a pulp hero, a Secret Agent X book, also from Airship 27. And one of the stories in here is actually by, where'd you go? By Frank Schildener, sitting there in the back, Dead Do Dance. That would be interesting to see. So I think the contest that we'll do is who met Phil the earliest, right? So, who personally met Phil the earliest? You raise your hands who you met Phil, and then whoever, well, I met Phil in 1972. Well, you're the winner, right? Okay, so who met Phil, first of all, in person, right? All right, these gentlemen back here, when did you guys meet Phil?
September 1970.
Okay.
Same.
Yeah. All right. Art?
Mine was like 2006.
Anybody else? Did anyone meet September 1970? Anyway, going once? Good. Tell us where.
The Detroit Triple Fanfare, where Phil first came out with his speech about the genealogy of Tarzan.
Okay.
And unveiled the coat of arms.
Fantastic. Where was that?
Detroit.
Okay. All right. It was the Detroit speech.
Right.
All right. All right. Fabulous. You guys win.
Yeah.
And I understand that you gentlemen, that you guys wanted to speak first. So with that said, we'll turn it over. You can duke it out for the gunfighter book or the secret agents book, and we'll go with that. So if you want to come up, I would say just please start sort of with a template. Introduce yourself, who you are, if you knew Phil, when, and then whatever great story you want to tell about you and Phil. So come on up, guys.
Okay, my name's Tom Krabacker, and I want to say that being asked to go first is a real pie in the face, because up until about 45 minutes or an hour ago, I had no intention of speaking here. I was only vaguely aware of what was going on, but Mike corralled me into it. And I think here's the reason why. Both Mike Toman and I were friends together as undergraduates at Michigan State University in the early 1970s. And we're in the science fiction fandom, and in Midwest fandom at the time, there were a number of small conventions that would take place in Ohio or Illinois or wherever. And they were the kind of things you could go to in a day or a half day driving. And Phil and Betty started going to these things around 1970 or 1971. And the conventions were small enough that you'd get a chance to just sit and talk to people. And Phil would be there, and Gordon Dixon would be there drinking. Gordy wouldn't, Phil didn't necessarily. And we kind of got to know each other because he was very approachable. They were both very friendly and affable. And even got engaged in a bit of correspondence, and we'd see them at subsequent conventions. Well, this goes back to the comment made yesterday, or was it Thursday, that Farmer tended to not just choose names at random, but he liked to choose names that had some significance, even if it's just a personal thing with him. And it turns out that I'm Tom, and that's Mike, showed up in his story, Sketches Among the Ruins of My Mind. If you've read the story, it's a science fiction story where an mysterious alien spacecraft appears over the Earth one day and circles it daily, and each day it passes overhead, the memories of one day is wiped from someone's mind. So you don't remember what you did yesterday, but your memories are solid up to that. And then the next day it passes, you lose the second day. And basically people's lives are being taken away from them. And the older people have longer to regress. The shorter people have less time to regress. And the main character has two little kids named Tom and Mike. And their memories are regressing. And at a key point in the story, Tom and Mike have degenerated into blithering idiots. Now I've wondered, and Mike's wondered, and we've never asked Phil, whether he chose our names for the blithering idiots because it was such an ironic contrast to the sophisticated intellects we were, or whether it was typecasting. So if I have one story, I guess, to say about Phil Farmer or something, that would probably be it.
Okay, my name is Michael I've been friends with Tom for what seems like forever, but it was only back in the 70s, which still seems like forever. And I'm the guy, I don't know if I remembered seeing something from Farmer or about how he was considering doing something with Doc Caliban and the Lovecraft mythos. But I actually wrote to Mr. Farmer in the innocence of my fanboy enthusiasm and told him that I had just experienced the night before a dream in which I had read the last, I don't remember the exact number, of the Bantam reprints of the Doc Savage books, and I had seen the James Bama cover with Doc duking it out with his shoggoth. And I thought this was a wonderful idea, and I wanted to share this with him just in case he thought that this might be a good idea to pursue. I'll let Tom continue from here because he remembers it in more detail than I do, because I was somewhat shell-shocked to get not one but two responses from Mr. Farmer on this proposal.
It was just, Mike would share the letters he'd get, or I'd show him what I get, but he got back what seemed to be a kind of standard response to a fan letter saying, you know, Mike, thanks for your ideas, it's really interesting, but it was clearly the kind of brush-off letter you give to be polite. And then, about a week later, he got another letter from Phil saying, you know, I've been thinking about your idea, and it really has potential. I forget what the exact wording was, but it suggests he was going to go ahead with it. And then when The Unspeakable Other, or I forget what the new title of it is, came out, it was kind of surprising to see that.
Yes, so I also, in the innocence of my fanboy enthusiasm and sincerity, would write letters to Mr. Farmer. And at that point, I had graduated maturity enough to realize that any letter you send to any working writer should always conclude with the boilerplate paragraph, well, I would be delighted to hear from you. I know that free time is in short supply, especially lately, and especially for working writers. So no reply, immediate or otherwise, is necessary or expected. So I would send things to Mr. Farmer occasionally. I sent him a Tom Mix DVD as if he needed more DVDs in his life. And since I was also a reference librarian, I was able to use the letterhead at my public library to request catalogs from every university press in existence, which would then come to my library in South Pasadena. And whenever I saw something that I thought, Philip José Farmer might want to know about this, I would send it to him, which is why he got updates on the latest information about the Sufi religion and any number of other things that, having read Farmer's works, I knew that he had at least mentioned once. So I would send these to him, never expecting a reply, because I also subscribe to the same notion that John Updike had in his essay that he wrote about Ted Williams for the New Yorker, in which he talked, it was called Hub Fans Bid Kid Adieu, and it included the immortal line, "Gods don't answer letters." Thank you.
Thanks, guys. That was
Oh, yeah.
fabulous.
Oh.
So I think, and I'm going to go back to Meteor House headquarters and review the files again, but I thought that I had scanned that correspondence, your letter, suggesting the Doc Savage or Doc Caliban Cthulhu crossover. I could be making that up. Maybe I didn't see the letter. I know that I saw a reference to it, at least in a fanzine interview that he did, where he said he had received a letter from a fan suggesting that. So one of those two, I got it somewhere. And I'll get back in touch with you as I'm working on the book.
Did you refer to the fan as a blithering idiot? That might have tied into that story.
Or one of the blithering idiot twins.
All right, so really in no particular order going now, I've got Bill Wormstead next. Bill, would you like to come up? And,
Yep.
All right, very good.
I don't think I'm going to need the mic.
We might need it for the video. Would you want me to?
Yeah, that might help.
All right.
New book.
All right.
I'm going to be reading a small extract. In fact, this is Phil's as far as we know, first published story. When Phil was in the fifth grade, his classmates wrote letters to the Peoria County Tuberculosis Association about their Christmas seal program and their fight against TB. A 10-year-old Phil, however, wrote a short story which they published in their open-air Crusader newsletter. And it's called Christmas Seals Fight. Crash, bang, I got you in the ribs. Ho ho, laughed Mr. Christmas Seal. Ouch, yelled Mr. Germ, just wait till I stick you. Mr. Christmas Seal and Mr. Germ were fighting for their lives. Mr. Seal was trying to put Mr. TB Germ in jail as he had been making children sick. He was the leader of a notorious gang. Sorry, can't talk right. He was the leader of a notorious gang of germs who were responsible for so much unhappiness among the children. Mr. TB greatly resented Mr. Seal's interference, and so they had come to blows. Just as Mr. Seal was about to win the battle, a number of Mr. TB gang appeared, and they all jumped on Mr. Seal. Mr. Seal had barely time to blow his whistle and call Mr. Milk, Mr. Vegetable, Mr. Fresh Air, and Mr. Sunshine. They pressed around the germs and soon killed them. Philip Farmer, grade 5, Columbia School. I don't know about you, but as a 10-year-old, I couldn't write that. That's far better than anything I could have done. As far as Farmer goes, I was originally a Burroughs fan. I got hooked with the Burroughs boom back in 1963. And I think it was somewhere around 1970, I was browsing the paperback racks and I saw a book and it had, oh, Tarzan's on the cover. Wait a minute, who's Philip José Farmer? It was the cover for Lord of the Trees, and it was an ace double with Lord of the Trees and the Mad Goblin. I read it, and immediately I started hunting down other Farmer books. And within a couple years, I was starting to haunt the old bookstores, and now I've pretty much read it all. Except for this.
John Small. Sir John Small.
Okay, so the year is 1975. It's the summer of 75. I've just recently turned 12 years old. I've read my dad's entire collection of Edgar Rice Burroughs stuff, having started with The Land That Time Forgot when I was in the 3rd grade, and was looking for new things. I found Doc Savage. I'd read the first 3 Bantam reprints, and I'm at the old Bell Scott department store in Kankakee with my mother on a shopping trip one day, and they've got a pretty nice book section for a store like that in those days. And I run across a Doc Savage book I hadn't seen before that had an entirely different byline on it. Who's Philip José Farmer? I don't care, it's Doc Savage, I'm gonna get it. And I'm reading the book, and it's, you know, I'm learning it's a biography. And the conclusion of the first chapter, the final paragraphs, is Phil describing some of the Doc Savage adventures. And I'm reading those final paragraphs and I'm thinking, I not only want to read these Doc Savage books that I haven't got my hands on yet, I want to read more Phil Farmer stuff, because anybody who can describe somebody else's work that well has got to be a hell of a writer himself. And come to find out, my dad had Tarzan alive, hadn't told me. So it's like, thanks, Dad. Read that. Dad got a copy of Adventure of the Peerless Pure, the old Dell edition that came and went before most people knew it. Time's Last Gift. My uncle gave me a copy of the first two River World novels. Years later, I'm in the Air Force. Just as Berkeley is re-releasing World of Tears novels, I fell in love with Phil Farmer. If I could have told the 12-year-old me in 1975 that one day I would get to meet Phil Farmer, not once but twice at his home, that I would get invited to contribute to a new edition of the book that made me discover him in the first place, I'd have laughed. I said, you're crazy. It all happened. I owe Phil Farmer so much. And I'm just going to read the last two paragraphs because it set me on a quest to not only find more Phil Farmer stuff, but to finally get my hands on that last Doc Savage novel. 30 years I had to wait. Deep in the earth beneath Maine are strange beings, looking exactly like Homo sapiens, but they have frightening psychic powers. Either they are extraterrestrials or they are the demons of hell itself. The first encounter between Doc and the devils is a draw, but other conflicts are inevitable, with the odds heavily in favor of the devils. Doc has met and defeated the greatest of human hosts of evil. Now he is faced with the origin of evil itself, and there the tales end. To a 12-year-old, you have no idea how frustrating that was. But it set me on a journey that I'm still on. Like I said, I've gotten to contribute to farmer-related works, and I've gotten to write a few of my own. Like I said in my contribution to the reprint of his Apocalyptic Life, it's been a heck of a ride, and it's not over yet. Thank you, Phil.
Mike.
Okay, so, you know, there's that old saying, you should never meet your heroes. But for me, that couldn't be further from the truth. I got to meet Phil, and he was just the most kindest, generous person you could imagine. As Mike and Tom were talking about, you know, just very approachable. First time I met him, I went to a book signing in Louisville, Kentucky in 1995. I had 2 boxes of books. I had one up in my hotel room, but I had 1 box of hardcovers with me, and they said you can only get 2 books signed at a time, so I'm standing in line with 2 books. What was the whole box? And then I went through the line again, I went through the line again, until finally the guy working at the hotel said, you know what, you can just leave that box with me. So each time I would grab 2 more, and then finally I was the only one left. And he signed a bunch of books, and there was about 5 minutes left in the signing. And I said, I've got another box of paperbacks, I'll be right back. Ran upstairs, swapped them out, came back down, he was long gone. So, but I don't blame him. I don't blame him in the least. The next time I met him, I went to Peoria. There was this thing called the Mid-America Book and Paper Fair that was like not even a mile from his house, and he would do a book signing. So I came up for that, and I said, hey, I have this thing called a web page on this thing called an internet, and I'd like to interview you for it. And he let me and another guy, Craig Kimber, come to the house, and we interviewed him, and we brought boxes of books and we got them signed, and we bought more books to the Mid-American Paper Fair and got them signed. And that sort of started our relationship. But the year after, I said, hey, I'm coming up for the Mid-America Book and Paper Fair again. And Betty said, well, do you have a hotel? Do you just want to stay at the house? And literally, I met them once, really for an hour and a half at their home. A year later, and there was some correspondence in between, but a year later, she's like inviting me to stay at their house. So that night, so I come up to their house the night before the paper fair, and we're eating dinner on their beautiful back patio. One thing Betty did, Betty used to flip houses before anybody knew what that was. They'd buy a house, and she would usually, the first thing she'd do, she'd put a big screened-in back porch on it. She'd fix things up, and then they'd sell it for a profit and move up to the next one. And so this house was pretty close to the pinnacle of the nicest house they'd been in, and they ended up selling it because they didn't like the neighborhood and actually went down in house. But we're at this house, this huge screened-in back porch with this huge round table. They invited friends over. We're eating dinner, and this guy named Lynn Carl, who Phil Tuckerized in Nothing Burns in Hell, there's a police sheriff named Carl Lynn, and that's this guy. He asked me, what was the first Farmer you ever read? And Phil's sitting, around the corner a little bit, over here on my left, and I look over at Lynn and I say, well, when I was 12 years old, I had to write a book report, so I'm looking through my mom's paperbacks, and I'm looking at all the covers, trying to decide what I want to do. And I pull out A Feast Unknown, and I hear this noise, this clatter. Phil had literally dropped his fork. Just from his so stunned, the fork fell and landed on the plate and made all this noise. And I looked over, he's just got this shocked look on his face, and I said, don't worry, I read like 10, 12 pages, and I put it back. And because we moved a lot, I basically wrote a book report on The Hobbit for like the 4th year in a row. But he was just, the kindest, sweetest man. Let me go through his files, let me and Wynn and Paul and Chris do Farmer File. We got to go up there over and over again and go through the files and keep finding new stuff. Did Farmer File, did Pearls from Peoria. And he and Betty, we're just always the sweetest people, just grateful to know the fans out there still knew who they were and appreciated them. And as you probably hear other people say here today, just really getting into Phil changed the course of my life, because I would have never got into publishing for any reason other than, to bring Phil's stories to life that that were stuck in the trunk, as it were. So, man, I had a great closing to this, and I made no notes, I didn't write anything down. I can't remember what I was going to say to end it, but like I said, meeting Phil and knowing Phil and working with Phil really changed where I am today. I certainly wouldn't be here. I would have never gone to Pulp Fest. Wouldn't have met most of you guys if it wasn't for Phil. So I'm doubly grateful for that as well. I was going to say you're next.
Am I next?
Maybe we're going to see.
I can go next.
Okay.
All right. All right, so it's probably no secret to anyone here that my first book, just like John's, was Dog Savage, Tis a Apocalyptic Life, when I was 8 years old. Just like Mike, changed my life, changed the course of my life. I wouldn't be here through all the chains of events, in terms of my fandom of that book and of Phil's Wolf Newton works and his mock biographies. But so my story really flashes forward to 2005. It's the 4th of July weekend is approaching, and I get this email from Mike, and Mike says, "Hey, I'm gonna go drive up to the Farmers over 4th of July weekend, long weekend, and look through the files for Farmer File, because he was starting Farmer File then. They had invited me to start contributing, and so I said, yeah, I get a plane ticket, sure, I'll figure out where to stay, I'll figure it out. And I'm going, like it's really fast. And hadn't even gotten a hotel room or anything, I just got on the plane and went. And I show up there, so I'm gonna one-up you. you at least met them, right? And they let you stay in their house. I had never met Phil and Betty at all. I think I had had one very brief phone call, about 30 seconds with Phil. Betty called the house and said, "This is Betty Farmer calling for Phil Farmer for William Eckert or something." And I said, "Oh my God." And then I was, a blubbering mess on the phone. So I'd never met Phil and Betty, and got there, and they were just wonderful people. And they said, "Well, you must stay. You must stay over." Kidding? I wouldn't let somebody that I just met stay in my house. "No, you must stay in the basement. We've got a guest room, and you can look at the files with Mike." And I'm like, "Look at, a grandmaster science fiction. You're letting this stranger into your house to look at the files." And that's how they were. They were the most generous, kind people, and I will always be so grateful for that. They must have thought I was crazy, because we were in the evening, or maybe it was late afternoon, looking at the files, and I'm thumbing through the files, and suddenly I see a manila file folder in the tab, and it's written Pemberley. And for me, as a Wold Newton fan, understanding that Fitzwilliam Darcy and Elizabeth Bennet from Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice, who lived at Pemberley House, they were at the Wold Newton event. I was like, "There's undiscovered Wold Newton stuff here," right? This is crazy. I got me yelling, and I'm sure they thought, "Who's this wild man that we've just let stay in our house?" And that turned into the novel Evil from Pemberley House. That night, they must have really been regretting allowing me to stay, because I got up and was, wandering around in the middle of the night to, take care of what needed taking care of in the middle of the night. And apparently, crossed into a room that I wasn't supposed to go to, and the house burglar alarm goes off. Right? It's at 2:30 or 3 a.m. and the sirens are going, and Betty comes downstairs, and what's going on? And I was mortified. But they didn't care. They were like, "It's fine, it's fine." Just like, this happens every day in the farmer's house. So I think really all I can say about Phil and about Betty, because this is also about Betty, is I'm so grateful to both of them for the way they were, and the fact that they were open and kind and welcoming like that, because that really enabled me to get to where I am today. It would not be where I am today. And I'm still, a blip in terms of being a writer and a publisher, but I'm very happy with it and content with it. And without them, their encouragement and just their kindness, my life would be very different. So, cheers to Betty and Phil. Frank Schilbier.
The only one here with his built-in heckling section right there. I had thought of reading something of Phil's, but there's going to be some other people doing it probably better and better choices than I do. So I just wanted to talk very briefly about what Phil actually gave me when I discovered him. I discovered him a little late than most people. I was about 15, and the majority of my reading material at that time went between Sherlock Holmes only and men's action books, which at a 15-year-old would really skew your way of looking at things. So a friend of mine who was into other stuff said, "Okay, you like action, you like adventure, read this." And he handed me Doc Savage's Apocalyptic Life. And I'd seen Doc Savage from Marvel Comics, odd-looking character, the way they drew him. And I'd seen some of the Bantam covers, which, when you don't have context on the Bantam covers, it's very confusing. So I said, all right, I'll shut him up at least. And I put down the Destroyer novel that night, and I picked up the book. And next thing I know, it's 6 a.m., and I'm still reading. And that changed everything. That day, I kept reading his book, called up my friend and said, "You're absolutely right." And he said, "Oh, well, I should have also given you Tarzan Alive." I said, "Sit still, I'm coming." It all changed then for me. I started looking beyond it. the easy stuff you can find in the Walden books, be Dalton. Phil Farmer opened a lot of worlds to me, and I can't pay him back, except I keep trying to write good stuff. I'll never be a Phil. He got me into loving the pulp, why we're all here. Doc Savage, Tarzan. Yeah, when I read Tarzan Alive, I had now to read those books again. I'd read them a little bit. And then I found the Ballantine editions, with those amazing covers, black ones, and I ended up having to find them. There's a whole story there, but I won't waste your time on it. All I can say is that Phil opened a lot of vistas to me. I'm a writer because of Phil Farmer. I have a much wider ability to read things thanks to him. I was pretty refusing to read a lot of good stuff because the school was trying to make me, and my attitude was, as most people's attitude, screw you. So every time I sit down and write a book, an article, or I'm reading something that a little outside, it's thanks to Phil. So thank you, Phil, and thank you all for listening.
Jess Terrell, Jess in the room.
Thank you. Shouldn't be long. It's a real honor to be here with each of you celebrating this wonderful legacy. For years I've thought about coming, was unable to make it, but here now. And you all each to be congratulated for continuing this legacy, this celebration of these wonderful works, and this very imaginative writer, Philip José Farmer. So pat yourselves on the back. We sat here the other night to roughly 12:30 a.m. watching a video with him and George McWhorter, someone else who I think a great deal of. And it was just a real treat. At the end, I was fired up. Everyone else I think was a little tired, but I was certainly excited. I recall seeing, I was always routinely every week visiting Rexall Walgreens stores and scouring that spinner rack, looking for another Burroughs book. And then one day I saw an Opar book. Gee, that's Burroughs, it's Tarzan. Oh no, it was Flight to Opar. I had discovered someone else was writing Opar stories, and I loved Flight to Opar. And certainly the continuation of those ancient Opar stories I think is absolutely superb, and I encourage that. Philip José Farmer's legacy also, by extension, continues Burroughs' legacy, which is also important to me. So please keep up the fine work, keep up these celebrations, and keep this dream alive.
Wayne, was there anybody else who wanted to go early?
Is there anyone who needs to go quickly or sooner than anyone else? All right.
Okay, just making sure.
Sure. Art. Mr. Sippo.
Thank you, Lee. I'm Art Sippo. I first discovered Philip José Farmer on bookshelves in the 1960s. We had written these very strange books that had very frightening themes to them, World of Tears and all that. It was a little bit too much for me at that point. But then I went to the old Bookmaster's bookstore on Times Square and I discovered A Feast Unknown. Okay? Now, of all the first books to get of Phil Farmer, that's probably one of the most unusual ones. I got this, and the cover had both Doc Savage and Tarzan on it, realizing that they were the pastiche characters. And I really, I was a big Doc Savage fan. I just started reading Tarzan. I just couldn't pass it up. So I went ahead and read the book. It was very strange and very frightening. I was 16 at the time, so this was a very interesting, formative time in my life. But I realized as I was reading that there was a lot more going on here than just a lot of strange things, some pornographic material and other things. And I got very interested in Mr. Farmer, and little by little, I started to read some of his other works. Along the way, Tarzan Alive came out. Of course, The Man Goblin came out, and Lord of the Trees. And we started really around 1970. It was Phil's pulp period, which went for about 20 years, thereabouts. And I was just a consummate fan. I was getting everything. I was getting chapbooks, all kinds of things. But for me, two things really were very important. First was, Phil came along at a point in my life when I was turning from a boy into a man. And when I had to start thinking of values. And one of the big things that Phil Farmer always had in his material was what I called the Farmerian hero. This was someone who did not pass over his moral decision-making to somebody else. This was someone who took responsibility for his decisions, and he made sure that what he was doing was right, not because someone else thought it was right, not because it went along with the program, but because he thought through it. And that was very important to me in a formative period. I also, like so many people have mentioned, the whole Wool Newton thing, when it came up, got me into reading a lot of things I would not otherwise have read. So it made me a much wider, broaderly educated person. And interestingly enough, I got linked up with the FarmerCon guys up in Peoria. The last FarmerCon when Phil was with us, he had had several strokes. I had a chance to meet him. He was not able to talk to us at the time, but he was there. And on that day, I got the chance, we went out to dinner and I got to sit down with Betty. And we had a nice long conversation at dinner time. And it was one of the most interesting things. Phil passed a few months later. And about 3 months after that, Betty passed. And knowing Betty, I think that she just couldn't live without him. It was a very romantic thing. There was so much in love, so much in sync. It was a tribute to the man and to his wife. They were a power couple. The one last thing that I think is ironic but a lot of fun, when Titan was republishing the various books of Phil's, they were balking at doing A Feast Unknown because they thought that it was too violent, too sexual and all that. And I talked about it with some of the boys from FarmerCon. So when they asked me to give a presentation actually at FarmerCon to talk a little about A Feast Unknown and where it fit into Phil's canon, the talk went very well. Wynn asked me to write a fleshed out portion of this, and we sent it to Titan Books, and it was one of the things that helped convince them to write, to publish the book. They included it as an afterword. They even let me do a short introduction as well. And I can't tell you how that made me feel, because that was the first book of Phil's that I had known, and I had the opportunity to help keep it alive. To keep it for future generations. So I owe a lot to Phil. I could go on and on about a lot of the influences from him, but I think that he was a genius. He was underrated in some ways, and people didn't quite understand, you know, a guy who was honest enough to talk about things that meant something to people, that meant something to readers, a guy who understood, and a guy who understood what real morality and ethics was about. Was taking responsibility for your own actions. That's my tribute to Phil.
I think I have something in my eye. A very brief coda to your comments about A Feast Unknown. So Titan, 2011-2012 time frame, did a deal with the Farmer Estate for to reprint, bring back several Farmer books back into print, which were well deserved. And you were right in a sense that the managing editor who was assigned the Farmer books, the book was already sold. So they had already bought A Feast Unknown. They had already paid for the rights. When it got to the managing editor, I think she started reading it. I think she was a little horrified. But your essay, I think, helped explain, you know, that it wasn't, that she was not interpreting it correctly. So, thank you for that.
One other thing, that essay, they just republished that essay in the Bronze Gazette.
Bronze Gazette.
This time.
Yeah, very good. All right, Will Emmons.
All right. Tough act to follow, but does this sound okay? I'm really bad with like technology and stuff.
Sounds good.
You know, Art's essay on Phil, if people haven't read it, is just really good. Jason Aiken, Sean Levin, and I put out this fanzine this year, and when I was originally going to write, I was going to write like some essay that nobody wanted to read about like Philip José Farmer and Marxism, and like it's interesting, like my friend Art is sort of a arch-Catholic, I'm sort of an arch-communist, and we like reach the same conclusions about like the morality of Phil. So I think there's something to that. Ralph Waldo Emerson had one of the lines in one of his essays that like I had to read in high school that was about how like when you're reading a book, it's like you're like having a conversation with a person, and I don't know if I ever really felt that way until I started to read Phil's books. Like he's like an author that gets inside your head. I never got to meet him. I graduated from college the same year he died and hadn't even heard of him at that time. I read these books, I'm like, wow, like, how many levels is this guy on? He's like, I'm from Kentucky, which for all intents and purposes is like the Midwest, and like, I had like a pretty similar religious upbringing to Phil, and I'm like, oh yeah, like, he like understands the weird quirks that this can cause in you, and this is really, there's something really going on here. I was having a quarter life crisis. I'm gonna go to this convention for this author that I've read one book by. It's A Feast Unknown. I read other books by him before I went to the convention, but so I feel like I have this relationship with Phil, even though he's not someone that I can like ever meet until we all get to Riverworld. You read these things, and so I've started to have relationships with, the whole FarmerCon family here, and getting into this fanzine, end up reading a lot of stuff by Scott Eckert, by Chris Carey, other people in this room, not just like these great fictional works that Meteor House puts out, but also a lot of criticism. And in the spirit of Phil, I would like to plug a conspiracy theory at this time involving people in this room. So Wynn told a really excellent story about his night staying at Phil and Betty's house, and he gets up and he sets off the burglar alarm. I would like to propose that the magic filing cabinet is either a myth or a euphemism, and the device that we call the magic filing cabinet is featured in a novel that is recently re-released by Meteor House Press, Tarzan and the Dark Heart of Time. It's a device where you can see across space and time. And so I think that Phil has had that from some point in the 60s on, and all these guys, they thought that Phil was like, he's really clever, but they didn't understand that he was actually really, truly tapping into the truth until like they themselves were using this also. So I am like fairly convinced that in his basement, Michael Croteau has the Dark Heart of Time. It's also called the Book of Tiznak in The Stone God Awakens. And if anybody is like a Borges fan, it's the Aleph. So you can, buy this fanzine. But to figure out how all that works together. So I guess I would just like to announce that the Meteor House people are totally lying to you when they say they write fiction. They don't. It's all true. I'm just really glad that there are people who are seriously considering what 9 dangerous individuals might be doing to control the world, and I really wish them well in their struggle or war even against the 9. So that's my conspiracy theory. I think that Phil had the Dark Heart of Time. I think Wynn and Chris and all those guys have utilized the Dark Heart of Time. Heidi's probably used it too. Like Hawks from Earth is totally like that's a thing that happened. It's not fiction. Anyway, so I wanted to just share that conspiracy theory with everybody. Phil is just like, I don't know, he's the image on my desktop of my computer. I look at a picture of him every day and I just look him in the face. Anyway, that's all I have to say about that.
I hope I survive long enough to get here next year. Thanks for that, Will.
I mean, you're the one who chose to write a novel about the nine.
Bad decision making. Keith Howell.
No prepared remarks, so just coming off when you need to. I have no conspiracy theories. I came to know Philip Farmer later than probably any of you guys. I was in my 20s. I mentioned before, I've written a blog before, and then they published it in Doc Savage edition once. Really up until the 90s, or like 1990. In terms of Philip José Farmer, the closest I'd had to an encounter with him and his writing was that I had seen a copy of Doc Savage's Apocalyptic Life at a library in Fort Hood when I was in 5th grade. And I took note of it. But that's about as much as I had. When I was a kid, I think I was 10 years old when the Doc Savage movie came out. I know everybody hates that movie. When I was 10 and living in Puerto Rico, we loved that movie. We saw it repeatedly, and we were running around, we were playing Doc Savage. We didn't know that here in the States, nobody liked it. We thought it was great. So, I came into it from that perspective. I'd already, as a little kid, Ron Ely was Tarzan for me, and Harry was Doc Savage too. Wow, that's cool. So anyway, I did a whole lot of reading. I was a voracious reader as a kid, but once I got into middle school, high school, girls and comics, and college, then forced reading. I wasn't doing much reading. Outside of some Clark and Heinlein, I just really stuck to comic books. And then about 1990, I think it was 1990, that was when Starlog published the lengthy 2-part interview with Philip José Farmer by Will Murray. And that's what pulled me to Philip José Farmer. I remember reading it. I was on a trip. I had gotten the Starlog, and I'm reading this thing. It was extensive. If you've never read it, I reprinted it actually on my blog. With permission. It's really good. It's comprehensive up to that point. Phil's got some great comments in there, great descriptions of the books and themes and all that kind of stuff. And I remember telling my wife we're on a trip to New Orleans, and I was reading it, and I said, who is this guy? Why have I never heard of him? Because every single book that they mentioned on there sounded like something I wanted to read. And so, probably the next year or so after that, we took a trip, drove to Kerrville, Texas. If you've ever been to Texas, you might know about Kerrville. If you haven't been to Texas, you've never heard of Kerrville. But we went out there. It's out in the highlands of Texas. And there was a used bookstore. Went in there, and I just thought I would look. And I found Farmer's books, and I walked out of there with Tarzan Alive, The Other Log of Phileas Fogg, and The Wind Wheels of Ishmael. So that's where I started. Right there. And yes, I devoured Tarzan Alive. It was like, wow, this is amazing. Good God, how did I not know about this? Other Log of Phileas Fogg blew my mind. It's like it just started from there and it just escalated. I just started every time I would go to a used bookstore, I would walk out with some new Philip José Farmer books. So I was just voraciously reading. I had no idea anybody else read this guy. It's just used books. Occasionally, I would suddenly shock myself. I'd have the World of Tears books, and I'd suddenly found Red Orc's Rage in a warehouse sale. I'm like, wow, that's kind of cool. I didn't know that existed. Grab that, read that, blows my mind. And we get to the point where we get to the internet age, and I get on the internet, and one of the first things I just decided to do is I use Dogpile, and I go searching for address, and I find Philip José Farmer's address online where I can access it. And I'm like, Peoria, I think that's him. So I drew a picture, because I was an artist, and illustration of Phil, and I had, Tarzan, and I had like a blimp back there and stuff like that. Anyway, it was about 11 by 14. I drew it up, and I wrote him a letter, And I mailed it to him. I never heard anything back. I didn't ask for anything. I did the same thing. I don't think they're in here. I said, you don't need to write me back. I don't expect that, blah, blah, blah. But I just wanted to let you know. And I told him about how much his books have impacted me and things like that. And I have lost to my memory all the details about how eventually Mike got in touch with me about doing something. And that was at the point where I kind of quit doing art. I decided I was burned out and decided to go back to law school. Best and worst decision I ever made. And it was in law school that I helped do some art for Mike related to Phil. And
Would you like to hold my
oh yeah, I did one of those, one of the covers that I've done. So since then, I've just done lots and lots of artwork related to Philip José Farmer. And I got to meet him a couple times. I got to be at their house, spent some time talking to Betty. I somehow inadvertently, you probably don't even realize it, I somehow started a signing frenzy at his house that time when we were up there. I got somehow stuck upstairs with Phil alone while everybody else was downstairs, and we were talking a little bit, and he was grunting, and he would laugh, and I would say something stupid, and then I realized this is around here, and I pulled out that copy of the Tarzan line, which has would you sign this for me, And he laughed. He said, sure, you got a pen? I said, yeah. When I grabbed a pen, and as he was signing it, I think Wynn came upstairs and saw that, and suddenly all these people came up, and then all of a sudden a whole big signing frenzy started. I thought I was slyly getting a book signed by Phil. It would have been my first book signed. I think that's the only one I actually got him to sign, was that one in his lifetime. Mike had been nice enough to get me a signature from him for that. That was really meaningful. I had it framed at the house, just that page from Phil with, I love your illustrations, Philip José Farmer. And that's just, I don't know how to explain it. It's just everything he's ever written has affected me. And it hasn't just affected me. That's when I'm sitting out there, it's good I did the preparing it, because as I'm sitting out there and I was listening to everybody and I'm looking at everybody, and the greatest legacy or impact of Philip José Farmer's writing, okay, not him as a person, that was different, but of his writing is that nobody just reads it. They all suddenly want to create themselves. It's like everybody out here almost, I think, has involved themselves beyond just sitting back and reading or sticking them in a bag and putting them away. Everybody here seems to be driven to analyze, to criticize, to publish, to draw, to write, and all of that. That's Philip José Farmer's life, is all of this. It's like he's gave birth to this. And it's kind of, I don't know, is there anybody else out there that nowadays that's like that? It just inspires so many people when they read it. It gets, like you said, it just gets into you and it makes you have to do something. Not just passively take it in, but to actually contribute back to it. Let it come out of you. And that's what it was like when I drew that picture for him. It had been bubbling up in me. It's like I needed to draw it. All this stuff in my head, I needed to get it out. And then I needed to share it. So I shared it with him. And somehow, here I am now, and I'm still doing it. Thanks, Mike. Thanks, Will.
I think I will speak for my partners in Meteor House, Keith, in saying that we would be utterly lost without you. So thank you for everything.
Yes.
Jason Aiken.
Hey everyone, I'm Jason Aiken, and my discovery of Philip José Farmer kind of coincides with my discovery and I guess of the pulps themselves. I started out as a pretty big comic book fan, and when you're researching the history of comic books, you're eventually gonna run into the pulps. Doc Savage, The Shadow, Tarzan, Conan. And throughout my research, a name kept popping up in relation to all, especially, The Shadow, Tarzan, and Doc Savage, this Philip José Farmer guy. And this was all about roughly 2008, 2009, 2010, somewhere. And once I really started digging in and getting some concrete information on him, I Googled one day, and it was announced that Mr. Farmer unfortunately had passed. And so I never even got to write him a letter or anything, which I'm still a little sad about, but he definitely left behind a great body of work. So I had a friend, and he's still my friend, named Rick Croxton. In the early days, it was the early days of the Book Cave. Art wasn't even the co-host quite yet. And I said, Rick, you do all these podcasts, you should do a Philip José Farmer episode. And he says, the next episode is going to be a Philip José Farmer tribute. I said, okay, I'm in. And I listened to it. And it is a long episode, probably between 3 and 4 hours. Wynn's on it, Paul's on it, Mike's on it for the segment, and then Art does a segment with Rick at the end. And it was like the Philip José Farmer explosion of information that I was looking for. I can't tell you how many times I listened to that podcast and just jotted down, okay, I need to get this book, need to get this book, that book, that book. A Feast Unknown was my first Philip José Farmer. But what I did first was I said, okay, I'm reading all this stuff about it. I can't just read it cold. I should probably read the first 2 Tarzan books and The Man of Bronze. So I did, and I think that gave me a real good baseline to see what Farmer was doing, and it wasn't as much of a shock as just going in cold. But yeah, I'm a huge fan of his entire pulp period, especially the King's Bar series. I like The World of Tears. My first FarmerCon was in 2011. I believe that was at FarmerCon 6 at Pulp Fest 2011. That's when I first met, Paul, Mike, Wynn, a lot of you in this room actually. And that was a great experience because the openness and affection that the farmer showed, all you guys showed that same to me, and I really appreciated that. You guys were very welcoming, and that's still appreciated to this day. And it's been great coming back every year and seeing everybody. This year I kind of took the next step in farmer fandom for myself personally. As Will mentioned, me, Will, and Sean, we started putting out our own farmer fanzine, hopefully in the spirit of, I believe, Farmerage and Farmer File, and now Farmer Fan. So I just glad to be here, glad to be, associated with everybody, and it's great being here to celebrate Farmer's birthday. Thanks.
Thanks, Jason. I'll just say, Jason, Sean, Will, how relieved I am now that I'm in my 50s, that there's a next generation who knows what they're doing and takes it seriously, just as seriously as we do. So thank you. Great job, guys. Get the Farmer Fan, please, everybody. Chris Carey, you're up.
Okay. I just wanted to say something about how
how welcoming Phil was and how encouraging he was to aspiring authors who were influenced by him. And I thought the best way to do it would be to read my remembrance to Phil that I wrote after he passed. It was published in Locust magazine in 2009. So I first met Phil just over 10 years ago, it was in 2009, when he was 80 years old. We corresponded briefly about an article I'd written, which he called stimulating. It was about enough to make my young writer self weep, having the man who'd written The Lovers and Tarzan Alive and The Unreasoning Mask write that to me in a letter. When in 1998 I drove from eastern Pennsylvania out to Peoria, Illinois to meet Phil at a local library event in his honor, he thought I was crazy. I don't know if it'll be worth the trip, he told me in his self-deprecating tone. I think that he secretly was pleased. He'd never achieved the same breadth of fame as some of his luckier SF peers, but I think maybe he knew he had something better than that. The ability to make each of his readers, or at least the perceptive ones, think that they've been let in on a secret. Otherwise, why else would he have planted such a wide array of esoteric Easter eggs throughout his writings? So many, in fact, that it would be impossible for a single person to ever find them all. At dinner 2 or 3 years later, Phil, who often wrote about immortality, joked with some friends and me that he really had the physical build of a 23-year-old, but was hiding it behind a clever disguise. Then he grew deadpan serious and said that anyone who had the secret to immortality would have to be willing to kill to protect it. Phil often played his literary cards close. There are in-jokes people will be rooting out of his writings 200 years from now, and probably just as many serious themes woven nigh invisibly throughout the dark web that is the Farmerian monomyth. That is the sort of thing that will grant Phil a kind of immortality. And trickster that he was, I think that he knew that. Immortality is better than fame anyway. I only knew Phil in his later years, so I don't know how he might have treated bright-eyed aspiring writers when he was younger. But I do know how he treated myself and my good friend Win Eckert and his nephew Danny Adams, not to mention each of the post-Farmerian Wold Newton writers with whom he was acquainted, who ran gleefully through the playhouse of his fictional Wold Newton genealogy. And that was respectfully, as peers. And for that, I know we are all as much shell-shocked as we were and are overwhelmingly grateful. And among the younger generation of writers who grew up reading the bloom of Farmer paperback originals and reprints in the 1970s and 80s, people like Chris Robertson and Reese Hughes and Michael Carroll and Paul Malman, Phil's legacy will go on. And that is another kind of immortality. In a way, Phil wasn't joshing. With his 2 strains of immortality elixir, he'll outlive us all.
Chris, I think you read a typo in the middle of that because you said his fictional Wold Newton genealogy.
Chuck?
Like Wynn and John and so many others, we all found that magic book, Doc Savage's Apocalyptic Life, when we were small children. And it awakened this saying in us. And it took us a long time to find each other. But I was just sitting there thinking, you know, we've all talked about, everybody's talked about experience, and our experiences are so similar. By the time I actually got to meet Phil, he was pretty much in a wheelchair and didn't have anything to say. And I saw so many people just leaning over, getting into his face, blah, 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 blah. And I know that just must have been nauseating for him. So I just walked up to him and said, "Thank you, sir." And I backed away, you know, I just said thank you. But what I was sitting there thinking is like, what this Wold Newton thing, I became obsessed with it. And I would try to tell other people about it, and their eyes would just gloss over. Does anybody remember that Blind Melon video where the little girl's wearing the bumblebee suit, and she's dancing around in it, and everybody's just kind of shunning her? And when I finally found Wynn's website, and I saw other people writing Wold Newton articles, and he invited me into this little e-group that he had, and there was like originally like 12 or 13 of us. I felt like the little girl in the Bumblebee outfit when she sees a bunch of other goofballs in Bumblebee outfits dancing around. And, you know, I had found my people, and we became friends, and then the friends became brothers. And, you know, I love you all very much, and that's pretty much it. I love you guys, and y'all are family, and I appreciate it. And thank you, Phil, for the feast.
We love you too. I'm serious. I mean that.
Even Frank.
Let's not get crazy. Heidi.
Hello, I'm Heidi Ruby Miller. I cannot think of Philip José Farmer without thinking of Christopher Paul Carey. Anyone who knows a little bit about my story, how I came to the Farmerverse, knows that it was completely because of Chris. I was lucky enough to write a bibliophile about Tongues of the Moon, which I know is one of those that not everyone has read, but I loved it because I came from an anthropology background, as did Chris, and he said, "You're going to love this book," and he was correct. And then I read Two Hawks from Earth, and I wrote a nice little short story. You already saw this one. That was in the expanded worlds portion of, I think this was number 3 that came out. And then that later led to Man of War, which I expanded. They have the short story in here, and it also expanded the further adventures of Two Hawks from Earth. And I would like to read to you the foreword that Chris wrote for me. I'm only going to read you a couple of paragraphs from it, but unfortunately this is going to play right into Will's conspiracy theory. I apologize for that way ahead of time, but I think that it says just as much about Phil and how I feel about the relationship that I had with a man that I also never met as well. Philip José Farmer once speculated in one of his novels about the existence of what he called the human magnetic moment. That is, a quality or field which pulls events together. This field, he said, slightly distorts or warps the semi-fluid structure of occurrences, of space objects intertwined with the time flow. In other words, it is the quantum effect that explains what the ancient Greeks called the three mori, or fates, what Carl Jung called synchronicity, and what we of the modern age are apt to dismiss rather blandly as mundane coincidence. Looking back, I believe a human magnetic moment of sorts occurred when Heidi Ruby Miller and I ended up in the same writing critique group in graduate school a decade and some change ago. And it's been even more change now. When Heidi and I first met, neither of us had any idea we would both one day expand upon the worlds and works of a grand master of science fiction. But then perhaps it's not so surprising. In my experience, if there is a human embodiment of the quantum entangling magnet that pulls events together, it is Philip José Farmer himself. Once one falls within the sphere of his literary influence, the semi-fluid structure of occurrences is bound to warp a bit and open up a dimensional gate or two. And I thank Chris for the opportunity, and I thank Wynn, and I thank Mike, and of course I thank Paul. Because without Meteor House, I would have never found the relationship that I do have with Farmer today. So thank you.
All right, well, it looks like we had Tom, and I apologize, I cannot read. Is there a Mr. Yates? Or,
yes.
Okay, sure. And then we have Paul Spiteri after that, and that should actually going to take us into our 10-minute mark.
Wow.
Hi, I'm Dewey Yates, and I'm an outlier in this crowd, I think, a little bit. This is my first Pulp Fest.
Welcome.
I mostly came for Joe R. Lansdale, but I was delighted to find out that FarmerCon was part of it, because I love Phil's work, and I'll kind of explain a little bit how I got to Phil, because it kind of ties into the way he does it. The things connect. So, as a kid, I loved monsters and Star Trek. So, eventually, when I'm reading, I get into sci-fi. So, I read the first Tarzan book, didn't read any of the others. Really loved it, but I didn't, for some reason, continue on. Then I went to science fiction, and I read the usual suspects, some Asimov, Heinlein, Clarke, who I still love a lot. And then I was into a lot of horror guys, so Stephen King. And he mentions this guy, Harlan Ellison, at Danse Macabre. So I got to find out about this Harlan Ellison guy. And that leads me to Ellison and the new wave science fiction writers. Again, Dangerous Visions and Dangerous Visions. And there's this story in there, Riders of the Purple Wage. And I didn't even understand it all. I still don't, even as an adult, and I've read Ulysses. But I love the play of the language. And there were other writers in those books, like Richard Lupoff's The Ben Fenn Boomer Boys. I don't know if you ever read that. And I just love that most of the writing up to that point is pretty much point A to point B. People are writing and moving along. But this was like language just exploding off the page and doing all these kinds of interesting things. And so I just became obsessed with him, and I read some of his books. Luckily, I grew up in the 80s when there was a lot of science fiction being published in paperback. So I read stuff like The Purple Book and The Unreasoning Mask. And, you know, it just, these other things, later in life, you read Ulysses, or you read some of the other things that he was playing with. And and Ellison was still one of my literary heroes in Lost in this year. That was just devastating to me. So I'd like to read one page from one of my favorite stories by Phil. This will be fun because this book is light. And unlike the rest of you, I have never read Doc Savage, though I bought it. And some of the Feast Unknown, I always heard about it, never read it, so I got that. So I got a lot of great reading ahead of me. So one of my favorite stories is The Making of Revelation Part 1. Okay, so it's a little tribute both to Phil and to Harlan. And in the story, God decides to film the Revelation. He has Cecil B. DeMille brought back to life to do it. And so he's going to do this huge, huge production, and they're going to do some rewriting of the script. Okay. They're doing it, Raphael shouted, but maybe you don't understand. This isn't the way things go in the book of Revelation. We'll have to do some very extensive rewriting of the script, unless you straighten things out. God seemed very calm. The script? How's Ellison coming along with it? Of course, God knew everything that was happening, but he pretended sometimes that he didn't. It was his excuse for talking. Just issuing a command every once in a while made for long silences, sometimes lasting for centuries. He had hired only science fiction writers to work on the script, since they were the only ones with imaginations big enough to handle the job. Besides, they weren't bothered by scientific impossibilities. God loved Ellison, the head writer, because he was the only human he'd ever met so far who wasn't afraid to argue with him. Ellison was severely handicapped, however, because he wasn't allowed to use obscenities while in his presence. Ellison's going to have a hemorrhage when he finds out about the rewrites, Raphael said. He gets screaming mad if anyone messes around with his scripts. I'll have him up for dinner, God said. If he gets too obstreperous, I'll toss around a few lightning bolts. If he thinks he was burned before, well, Raphael wanted to question God about the tampering with the book, but just then the head of budgets came in. The angels beat it. God got very upset when he had to deal with money matters. So that questioning of religion, too, was part of it, and the language and the fun, the humor of that, it was just brilliant. And I never got to meet the man, but as you said, you kind of meet him in the books. So thanks to Phil for all the reading I've had so far and all the reading I'm going to have after the ton of books I bought.
I can't think of anyone more fitting to wrap this with than Paul Spiteri.
Good afternoon. I'd like to talk about how I first came across Phil, how I started on that yellow brick road, and how it led me all the way to here and the adventures and friends I had and made along the way. So I guess my story starts when I was about 12 or maybe 11, can't remember exactly, and I loved lists, and I bought books that had lists, and one of them, and Irving had a series of books that just had lists, and one of them was 10 fictitious science fiction planets. And I'm reading about Dune and Ringworld, and I get down to the bottom of the list, and there's Riverworld. Actually, at the top. But Riverworld, and there's a brief description on this planet, encircled by this river. Everybody who's ever lived is reborn on the banks. What? I mean, just the thought just blew me away. So, put the book down, went down to my local bookstore, and there were 2 Phil Farmer books there. There was Dark as the Sun and Riverworld and Other Stories. I lucked out. Riverworld, that's what I want. So I bought both books, didn't realise that Riverworld was a short story, not the whole series, but soon found out what that was about. Read that book, loved it, I was hooked. Dark as the Sun, for many reasons, is one of my favourite Phil Farmer books because how early I read it. Absolutely brilliant. Had to find more. Found every book I could, toured everywhere I could, sent cash in the post to the States from the UK, you know, trying to get books, and they would send me books back and credit notes, and they didn't have them, useless to me. But slowly built up my collection, and then came the internet. Dial up at home, managed to find even more books, ordered them, got them sent over. And one of the things I bought was a convention program from a guy called Tracy Knight, who some of you will know. And it was full of stuff. And we started a bit of an email conversation, and I said, you know, of all the great stuff that was in that convention program, it was the Phil Farmer that I was interested in. And he wrote back and said, oh, I was with Phil yesterday, we were doing a signing together, which turned out to be the round robin Farmer book, Naked Goes the Farmer. So that blew me away, and you know, friendship developed. A couple of years later, I was in the States, and I was meeting up with Tracy, and you know, I rocked up, you know, with my family, and we were talking, and Tracy said, you know what, Phil rang me a couple of weeks ago, invited me over for dinner tomorrow night, and I said you were over from the UK, and he said, get them to come along, you know, so what? So it actually turned out it was Phil and Betty's 60th wedding anniversary that I was being invited to. Tracy didn't tell me that off the bat, but so we had an adventure finding a present for them on the day, and you know, we park up outside Phil's house, and it's a normal house. It's not even anything, you know. He doesn't live in a mansion, and he doesn't live in an alternate universe or anything. And I'm walking up the drive, and I'm, you know, wow, I'm here. And I get to the door, and people go in, and Phil's at the door, and he takes my hand and says, hi. And I said, oh, I'm Paul Spiteri. And he goes, Spiteri, where does that name come from? And I'm not even over his threshold, and there's a 10-minute conversation about my hereditary, my you know, the language of the art, you know, and he's telling me stuff. You know, he's telling me about all sorts of things. And so that was the start of just a fantastic friendship with him and Betty. Over the next few years, I visited with them at least once a year, sometimes twice. We talk on the phone all the time. And honestly, you know, knowing Phil and Betty was one of the most rewarding friendships of my life. And, you know, it's just not the same without them. But, you know, and that led me, before I start to get emotional, that led me into, you know, things like working on Pearls from Peoria, Farmer File, Meteor House, and you know, the friends I made, Chris, Wynne, Mike, particularly in those early days. And as we moved on, so many more people. And a lot of people talk about the Wald Newton family, but for me, it's the Farmer family. And you know, you're my family, and some of you are new, Will, Janine, Kevin, Emily as well. You know, meeting some of you for the first time this year and some last year. And I just want to thank you all, because it's, to me, that is what it is. And you know, I mentioned Tracy earlier. He ended up being, him and his wife Sharon, godparents to my youngest daughter. You know, so we've kind of cemented that. And like all good families, I hope this one grows and I hope it gets deeper. So thank you, and thank you, Phil and Betty.
Everyone, that concludes. I'm sorry, we're going to have to defer to our next folks. I'm really sorry that we're at time. This was everything we could have hoped for. These tributes, the talk of family. Thank you, everybody, for coming and for sharing your thoughts and your feelings about Phil and about Farmer and Betty. Forget Betty. Thanks a lot.